Detroit. A little backstory for those of you that are not members, although I'm looking at the beautiful faces and see a lot of our membership. But Impact 100 Metro Detroit was founded in 2015 by a group of all volunteer women. We were motivated to fuel transformational change in Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb County. We aspire to make a difference where we live, work, and play, and are committed to supporting our hometown heroes, the people who are selflessly giving of their time and talents to make our communities a better and safer place for everyone. We are a collective giving women's organization, but we are so much more than that. In addition to awarding high impact grants, we are also committed to building the capabilities of our membership through book discussions, networking, volunteering, and listening and learning like we're going to do today. Now more than ever, I know I have to listen. I have to listen to learn, into Black and brown voices to help me, guide me to be a better human, to be a better ally, and a better advocate. And with that in mind, this morning we are thrilled, you've already heard me say that, to be joined by Michael Rafferty. Michael is the president and CEO of New Detroit, Inc., one of the nation's first anti-racism coalitions. New Detroit was founded in 1967 and serves as a coalition of leaders working to achieve racial understanding and racial equity in Metro Detroit. Michael's background and expertise are in community economic development, public policy, and nonprofits. Deb DeBose and Kelly Walsh will be our moderators today, and they're gonna sort of own the mic. A little bit of housekeeping: your line should be muted. Send a chat if you have any tech issues to Kelly Walsh. She'll do her best to help solve those. And if you want to ask a question, ask either Deb or Kelly, or just ask it in the chat. But let me flip it over. Deb, you're off mute, so let me flip it over to you first and take it from here.
Well, good morning, everyone. And I too am thrilled that we were able to get Mr. Rafferty on online with us this morning. So let's just jump right into it. Racial inequity is far from new, but then we got this global pandemic and recent instances of violence toward Black and brown people in the US, which have magnified racial disparities. So fortunately, here in Detroit, we have an organization called New Detroit, which was formed in 1967. And Michael, if you could just tell us a little bit about the history of how New Detroit was formed in 1967 following the disruption.
Yeah, speaking of disruptions, again, I'm sorry for my dog barking in the background. Amy, thank you so much for that warm introduction. Deborah, thank you as well. It's an honor to be here, to be honest with you. I can't count how many times in the last few months that I've had friends and people who, I didn't realize were friends, people who I hadn't talked to in a very long time, calling me saying, what can I do right now? And I'm all too happy to have those conversations, even, distanced and contexts like this where there are a bunch of new faces before me. The organization, as you mentioned, was formed in 1967 after the rebellion, and I like to think of it as a moment where everyone had their value proposition toward anti-racism. The mayor, the governor, captains of industry all got together and said, we can't have this anymore. And they pulled together essentially a committee that was like a round table with community leaders and residents, and said, what can we do and what's wrong and what can we do to fix it? And that turned into this organization. And over the last 50 years, there are a number of things that we've done, both obvious and large, and small and behind the scenes. Many people don't realize that Wayne County Community College was started in large part by New Detroit. The Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, my alma mater in a lot of ways, was formed by New Detroit. We had this large, strong intermediary space trying to change systemic racism, even as far back as 50 years ago. And I came on a year ago for one really important reason. I was born and raised in the region and in the city, and we live in Detroit. And as I mentioned earlier, I have a 3-year-old and an 8-year-old, and I don't want them to inherit racism. It's just that simple. And we need not just people who are vocal individually about the need to end racism, but we need an institution that's strong enough to be able to move us toward institutional change and systemic change and even interpersonal change around issues that are specific to race and racism. So again, I'm honored to be in the role after this incredible 50-year legacy, and I'm honored to be here before you all, talking about the history and what's next with the organization.
Well, I had the good fortune to participate in one of your conversations on race workshops, and we talked a lot about race as a social construct. And I think maybe some people don't understand or know what that means. Could you talk a little bit about race as a social construct?
Yeah. So, I'm going to use bold words, and I hope that's okay. There's a lot of how we think about the world, generally speaking, is white supremacist and patriarchal. We're very, sort of Western centered in how we think about things. And when you examine, humanity across spectrums, people tend to look at race as a biological thing. In the late 1800s, there was a lot of, science going into proving almost that there was, a hierarchy, a biological hierarchy, and that, race happened to be this determining factor that showed that hierarchy. That science has been debunked, quite frankly. And when you look at new science, particularly around genetics, it becomes obvious that, sure, we have differences physically that are genetic, but we're more than 98% similar. And, part of the economic imperative to, especially the United States, to perpetuating the construct of race, it dates back to the transatlantic slave trade, quite frankly, right? And so, we've moved into this place, now where not only do we have these, I would say in some ways, false distinctions about biology, but also false distinctions about character, false distinctions about intelligence and ability and that sort of thing. And quite frankly, it's all bunk. Speaking to a room here of women, many constructs have been formed across gender lines too. And I think as we all start thinking about ways to make humanity more humane, it's really important to acknowledge things like the falsehoods of our opinions and the falsehoods of our understanding, the falsehoods of the history that we've got. So I appreciate that question. It's not typically where we end up starting, but it's a very profound one, and one at some point I'd love to dig into more.
Well, we wanted to tackle the tough stuff first.
That's good.
I know you also have several different workshops and things that people can participate in, but I know you have two basic categories, racial understanding and racial equity. Can you talk a little bit about the differences and similarities maybe between those two? I think equity in particular.
Yeah. So there are so many words that go along with the idea of anti-racism, and I use the word anti-racism almost as an umbrella that includes a lot of other points. You'll hear the words diversity, equity, inclusion almost in one state. Racial diversity, equity, inclusion almost as one statement. Racial justice, racial understanding, et cetera. So and we, for I would say the last 20 years, have been looking at this region and saying, we have a spectrum of understanding about race. We have people who have lived experience that, is irrefutable and demonstrates all of the things that we know are symptoms of racism. And we have people on the other side who are asking the question, well, is racism really a thing? Like anytime I write an op-ed, I do the thing that people say don't do. I'll read the comments almost as opposition research, right? And understanding, how far we have to go to, really address some of the thinking that we have out there. And, on the far end of the spectrum, there's a clear demonstration of lack of understanding. right? And that includes some of the things we spoke of a second ago around race as a construct, right? That understanding that race is a construct and not biological. You begin moving a little bit forward, closer to understanding race and racism. You get to understand your connectivity to, your fellow man. You get to understand your connectivity to someone who doesn't look like you. But going beyond that, racial understanding is, I would say, having this, clear moral imperative to addressing some of the things that are symptomatic and symptoms of racism. There's a poll that happens regularly through Gallup, where they sample white Americans and ask them roughly the same questions to understand where white America is on race. And every single time, plus or minus 1 or 2%, this has been the case, for years. It'd be interesting to see the data from this year, but 55% of white Americans from these studies either don't believe that racial bias exists, or if it does, they don't believe that there's a moral imperative to doing anything about it. The other 45% understand that there's such thing as racial racial bias, implicit bias, but they don't know what to do about it, right? And so when you're looking at a majority, 55% historically, there's generally speaking, a lack of racial understanding there, right? And so the very first step to being able to have any intervention is to change that, to do almost what Ralph Nader did when, the crash test dummies and all the data came out around automobile safety, creating a sense of understanding of the real problem and challenge. And now, after all that campaigning, my kids are strapped in like astronauts every time we're in the car, right? So, that type of social change starts with awareness and understanding. The racial equity point, when you look at, I often say racism is like the cancer, right? And then you have multiple symptoms that you might, go to the physician for. You have a headache, you have a cough, you're nauseous, right? The symptoms of racism end up giving us data points and statistics like, and these are real stats, Black women are 2.5 times more likely to die during childbirth than white women. Other stats, in Michigan, Black Michiganders make up about 14% of the population, yet, we account for, more than 40% of the deaths, and so when you see numbers like that, here's an economic point that's striking to a lot of people. For every $1 that a white family has in wealth, a Black American has 7 cents. When you see those gaps, the point about equity is obvious, and lack of equity is obvious. So we've historically thought about our work and our interventions in those two categories. How do we create understanding, and how do we lower the gaps and close the gaps? So I hope I got to your point.
We have a question that came in from the chat that's related to this. First off, though, can you repeat that stat about the money for every
$1 that a white family has in wealth, and that's non-liquid. It's your house, it's your car, it's stocks. For every $1 that a white family has, a Black family has 7 cents.
7.
Yeah. And as far as income goes, for every $1 that a family has, a white family has, a Black family makes 57 cents, right? So, these are, they're clear, there's clear empirical evidence that racism has existed. And so, when we get to the point about racial understanding, when I'm reading those comments, it's like, okay, we have a lot of work to do to elevate and amplify these points, these points about, where the gaps are and how that ends up changing the dynamic of quality of life, and and almost the aggregate and baseline of experience that we have as Americans.
Wow. Okay, I would take us down to, you just blew my mind. 7 cents.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like literally, wow. But we have two questions that have come in. The first is, I think, most related to what you said, and then the second one would take us into a different kind of conversation. So first, how does racism vary across generations? Are you seeing that millennials are seeing it differently? And just even from a generational, is there going to be generational change simply with that alone? Or what are you seeing in that area?
So a lot of the qualitative engagements that I have give me hope. A lot, in having conversations with people who, are millennials. I see a lot of people who, outside of just race, every millennial that I've talked to around real social issues, it really impressed me. Right? I mean, they're concerned about the environment. They're concerned about the national economy. They're concerned about our global positioning, and reputation. I mean, I'm amazed, and maybe it's just because I'm talking to a lot of really smart young people. And around race, it's the same thing. I don't hear, quite frankly, as many young people with the same rhetoric or the same opinions, about race. They're very interested in anti-racism. They're very interested in doing things toward equity, and you see it represented and illustrated in protests. I've been amazed at, number one, how peaceful the protests have been across the country, but also just how multicultural these protests are and how multi-generational they are, with so many millennials being the ones who are organizing these protests and participating in them. I believe that a lot of the thinking that there's a lot of antiquated thinking. Let's just put it that way. I would say racism itself is an antiquated concept. It's an antiquated, all the conversations that perpetuate racism is a bit antiquated. And so, I often hear people say that, the policymakers, the institutional leaders, and even the family members who end up perpetuating these really negative stereotypes and things like that happen to be, of older generations. And, it makes sense. My mother was born in 1940 in the South. And she was one of the first Black fashion models in the Midwest market. And she's got amazing stories to tell about what it was like to come from the South and, live through Jim Crow and come to the North and have a lot of the same experiences. Now she's, as a Black woman, she's had the experience of racism. She's been told no, and she's been told she can't drink out of that fountain, and she's been told, she wasn't entitled to a certain level of authority within her roles, her jobs. She wasn't given access, and that memory, definitely, fuels her to be interested in anti-racism. But the people who were her victimizers, right? They're still around too, and so I guess a simple answer to the question is, I do believe we're progressing. I do believe we're moving toward a state where, every generation, gives us more movement toward the desired state.
Everybody, all the participants were muted.
Thank you. So another question is, many of us have our professional and our volunteer lives and organizations that we're part of. And every organization is at different parts of their journey. And often a message is kind of that not yet. We're too busy to handle structural racism right now. There are other priorities ahead of us. Can you share some examples of organizations that have been successful in integrating this work and just basic decision making?
So I guess the best place to start with that is a recommendation and a suggestion for reading. If you haven't read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, I recommend you do that. He doesn't talk as much about sort of the steps or examples of people who've done the right thing, to become an anti-racist institution or organization. But he does say this one thing that I think is very compelling for anybody who's on that journey, whether it's you personally or you as an organization. Unfortunately, it's a binary. It's either you are moving yourself and your organization toward anti-racism, or you are perpetuating racism. It's just that simple. And, you know, as an organization, if you're not really taking all of the meaningful steps to understand your culture, understand where racism exists within it, the policies, the procedures, the engagements, you know, the extreme intention or lack of intention to creating leadership that's not just diverse, but equitable and inclusive. And I'll be honest, you know, there are a lot of people, most people that I talk to who run organizations, most of the boards that I sit on, that conversation about the bottom line and about risk happens to be far more important than the conversation about moving toward anti-racism. You know, most institutions are like battleships, you know, and steering them, you know, takes a long time. And, you know, I've seen elements of really good things, but I've not seen in any organization, quite frankly, you know, all of the steps that are required to get us to the desired state. I've heard of folks like Aetna Insurance, you know, having said, you know what, we have to go publicly and apologize for our role in slavery. We insured slaves, and they went out and they publicly apologized. Cone, the Cone hospital system out of North Carolina, they were part of the landmark decision to desegregate hospital systems across the country. When the current CEO realized that about that hospital's history, he's a white man. He actually, I met him. He cried in the office and said, "We have to do something about this," you know. And he, you know, not just made public statements of apology, but you know, he actually set aside funds for the community to address some of the disparities in public health and housing and income in that community. I would say, you know, and this is something for individuals and it's something for institutions. It's a journey. When we talk about how systemic racism is, I mean, it's a sponge that's saturated. It's a towel that's saturated, right? And it's drying a towel is a process. It takes time to really get through all the elements of moving an organization toward anti-racism. There are other, you know, institutions. I just saw the note, Georgetown University. They did the same thing. They went public and said, "We're sorry. You know, we've done bad things." I believe, you know, Harvard University did the same. But no, I mean, as far as like the ideal state, we're not there yet. I haven't seen one.
Can you, we had another question come in. Can you define anti-racism?
Mm-hmm. So when we think about things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, those things bubble up almost, you know, into those things. I'm sorry, can you hear me? I think I just got some feedback. Yeah. Okay. Those things bubble up into anti-racism. It's a state where race is seen as a construct, and it's not a determining factor in behavior, in interpersonal engagement. Anti-racism was, you know, a word that has been circulated probably for the last decade, maybe a little more, as almost the state opposite of where we have been, right? Because when you end up looking at, you know, when a lot of people in organizations end up looking at these symptoms and calling them racism, right? Looking at the gaps in income, looking at the gaps in healthcare, looking at the gaps in health quality, looking at the gaps in incarceration and law enforcement and things like that. Anti-racism is almost, you know, the existence of, it's almost like, you know, saying health, right? When we're saying removing cancer, we're saying creating a state of health. Anti-racism is creating a state where you don't have those gaps and you don't have the personal behaviors and the institutional behaviors that lead to those gaps. It's not an Oxford definition, but
sometimes the ones that aren't Oxford make more sense. So thank you.
I hope I did.
So a question that's related to when you talked about Aetna, just how much do public apologies from companies, how much does that really help in the fight against racism and feeling that Black voices are being heard?
It's incredibly helpful. I'm saying that as a Black man, and I'm saying that as somebody in this work. Imagine the experience of being bullied. Imagine the experience of having, a terrible, disruptive, and abusive experience with a friend or a partner, right? You can't get to a state of reconciliation without without an acknowledgement, oh, I've done something wrong, and a statement that moves you away from having from doing that thing wrong. As Black Americans, as we've said, things aren't equal. We're afraid. We're afraid of being lynched. We're afraid of being abused at work. We're afraid of driving. And we hear things like racism doesn't exist. We feel gaslit, right? We feel a lack of hope, because if we're not hearing, let's dig into this from the system. If we're not hearing, let's dig into this and change it. We know that we're a part of the system. We know that we're a part of we have to go to work tomorrow. We have to drive to get to work tomorrow. We may not feel well on the way. We have to go to the hospital. And each one of these systems that we have to connect to, if we believe that not only are we going to have a bad experience based on our own experiences and based on the data and the information from all of our from the community as a whole, if we believe that we're always going to have a bad experience, and we don't have the institutions and the individuals actually stepping up and saying, maybe you're right, we start losing hope, right? In any relationship you have, the moment somebody says, you know what, I'm wrong, or I was wrong and I apologize, you have hope in that relationship. We have a social contract, and it's important to make sure that we have faith in that social contract. So it's in my experience and opinion, it's enormously helpful. And historically, it's been helpful too. I mean, and we've seen processes of truth and reconciliation be very effective. It was a process in South Africa. It was a process following World War II. It's something that we haven't really applied to the context of racism in America. And honestly, truth and reconciliation is something that I think is a meaningful step toward anti-racism.
That's great. Thank you so much. I want to point out that we've had a few people share some resources in the chat. So if you haven't taken a peek, and thank you, Paul, and thank you, Dr. Lisa Jackson, for sharing some information. Those are all the questions that have come in right now. Deborah, did you want to take your next question up?
Mike, can you talk to us a little bit about your 2020 scorecard? I know it's chock full of data and metrics that might be useful to share.
Yeah, well, I'd be happy to. I mentioned I came in about a year ago, and as I looked over the history of the organization, I saw that we were a part of some really meaningful reports and information that helped us guide our work. And I thought, I want to collect this type of information annually, and I want to have all of the data on race and racism. It's important for me to do that. One, as we talk about designing tools and programming. It's important because we have a lot of partners within the space of diversity and inclusion and equity and anti-racism work that need, almost a central thought leader, who has an outside partner who has information that can be shared. And it's important for us to be able to have a sense of how far we have to go before, a desired state is closing these gaps. So we need to understand what these gaps are, and we need to understand them regularly. So I set out late last year to begin collecting as much information as we could on race and racism in the region and the country. And we have started analyzing it. We have an interim report. This one report is going to be it's the first product of a series of products that's going to come out this year, culminating into a much more robust report. Also, industry specific white papers. And even campaigns. We want to have social media campaigns, and we're trying to pull the resources together for PSA. The report started, so the data gathering and analysis started toward the end of 19, and as we moved into the first and second quarter of the year, of course, COVID happened to change a lot of our lives and just about everything that we had been doing and thinking about. And we made sure to include, sort of the emerging research and the emerging information on COVID and the disparities there. And some of the things that came, out of that research were really important for us and a lot of our partners, specifically around COVID. So we learned that sometime in March and April, that even though I said this earlier, we account for 14% of the population in the state, and more than 40% of the deaths. The next question is why? And when we start examining that number and those issues with other factors like housing and income and incarceration and things like that, we start seeing why we have these large gaps and these large disparities. One of the obvious reasons that we have such a disparity in COVID is clearly because of pre-existing conditions. African Americans have traditionally higher rates of diabetes, higher rates of asthma, higher rates of heart disease, and other even coexisting health conditions. And we know that COVID ends up more negatively impacting people with those types of conditions. But that's almost where the conversation would stop. And as we dug into the data a bit more, it was obvious that a lot of African Americans, particularly in this region, are overrepresented in jobs that are considered essential, service jobs, where there's sustained contact with the general public. Other things like having lower wages, generally speaking, without paid sick leave, often leaves African Americans in this region with no option but to continue to go to work, even when sick. 25% of Detroiters have a hard time accessing healthcare, sometimes because of transportation, sometimes because of fear, and sometimes honestly because of cost. And when you start layering all of those things together, when you're looking at the hotspots in the state and you're looking at Detroit, part of the reason why we had the condition that we had in March and April, and we still see, is in part because of all those things. So the data work for us was really important, like I said, to have this longitudinal understanding of what's happening. But it was a really timely report, and it was a really timely gathering of information, and just to give us a sense of what's happening today and right now, and about something that's so important. I encourage you to take a look at it. It's on. In fact, I'll put the link to it in the chat. It's on our website, and it covers 6 different categories that allow us to get a firmer grasp of what's happening right now. And there will be a lot more information coming out from us over the year and over the years. So turn your attention to our social media and to our website for new stuff.
So Mike, I've a question. Thank you very much for that. And so someone's asked about the programs of one point, just a little bit of a clarity. Did you say that you're planning on making this data like an annual, so that like from a longitudinal standpoint, or do you see one part? For me, I've been struck by that there doesn't seem to be as much data as I would kind of expect around this, and this being, it's a big issue. So recognizing that's hard to say, but are you expecting this to be part of what becomes a New Detroit product? And then also, can you just speak, someone asked if you can speak and describe some of the current programs under the New Detroit umbrella.
Sure. Yeah. So the data itself to me is a raw material. The products are multiple. So every year we're going to collect the data, analyze it, analyze different buckets and categories of the data together, and publish a series of documents that we feel are relevant, meaningful, and timely. One of the so the answer is yes, we are going to collect the data annually and longitudinally. But as we look at the data, we start seeing patterns and themes emerge that we feel is necessary for us to dig into and perhaps have a different product for. So we've seen a lot of really interesting data around law enforcement and incarceration, for example. And the aim right now is to write a white paper that goes very deeply into that area, and make sure that it's available to law enforcement, policymakers, the general public. But knowing that not everybody wants to read a white paper, we have to basically consider ourselves the Rosetta Stone, with all this data. And so taking bits and pieces out and putting them into different vehicles like social media, like op-eds and things like that is the other part. So you're going to end up seeing a lot of information coming from us is the point, but the data gathering and collection is going to be something that happens in an ongoing fashion. As far as programs, we have two legacy programs that we are very proud of. They're still running, and we are actually overhauling them and expanding them. One is organizational cultural competency. It's almost an organizational development tool where we go in and provide historic context on race and racism, racism in the modern context, and spend time giving that racial understanding sort of curricula to institutions and organizations as a whole. The other is multicultural leadership, and it's a tailored professional development tool. So as think Leadership Detroit, but just focused on creating leaders, managers, C-suite leaders, et cetera, who are keenly aware of the importance of removing bias and increasing cultural competency and awareness for themselves personally. But we're designing new tools now. My vision is to have enough tools for just about every problem in the house, basically become the handyman around the subject of anti-racism. And one of the ways that I intend to do that is to take an industry by industry approach and design tools for specific industries. We just started in December, we started to design a program called Just Place, which is essentially a transformational process for retail and hospitality. So, the bartender, the waitress, the hostess, they all get safe serve training, but as they engage with the general public, many of them may not have any awareness of bias. They may not have any awareness of their own bias. They may be in that category of 55% who don't believe that bias exists, but the interpersonal engagement ends up creating places and experiences that I personally have had, going into places where you feel different, you feel like they're treating you differently than they are someone else, and unfortunately, in the region in Detroit, we've heard the news about someone getting the police called on them, and all they did was ask for something different. Like I've heard lots of those stories. But creating training that creates cultural competency, reduces bias, teaches the people who work in these spaces to how mitigate conflict, actually going into the policies of the organization to see where there can be change that improves the relationships within the organization too, is what Just Place is. And the aim is really just to make these public establishments more welcoming to customers of all culture, in all races. When COVID came, we lost a lot of the market. A lot of retail was having a hard time, and so we wanted to keep the momentum going. And we're currently wrapping up a pilot with Henry Ford Health Systems. We decided to take Just Place and apply it to the healthcare industry, and it's called Just Care. And the aim there is to provide anti-bias training, or bias awareness training, and cultural competency to healthcare professionals. And my aim is to scale that up to include everybody within healthcare systems. When you go to a hospital, you see the security guard first, you see the valet, the person at the front desk who takes your information and chooses where you stand in line going to see the doctor. Everyone needs this type of work, all the way up to leadership and governance. And we're building these tools out, and we're building our partnerships to make sure that we're able to cover all these bases.
So we had a question come in so I'm going to read it. What are your opinions on taking a step back to educate white people versus lifting Black people up and supporting them, especially in the workplace? I get that we need to do both, but which is more important and how can we do both at the same time?
I think the best way, that's not as simple as walking and chewing gum. I get that. It is important. Well, first, I guess it's almost like it's almost an individual by individual situation, right? When you're talking about, organization A and organization B, if your Black workforce happens to have been deeply abused and challenged in this space, that's your priority. If your, white workforce happens to be completely, unaware, but I mean, there's a need for organizational cultural audits, to be able to determine which priority, which one is priority. And that's actually another tool that we're building out in partnership with the Crossroads out of Chicago. Those tools don't exist at the scale that I think they need to, given how many organizations that we have. But you need that diagnostic to be able to figure out something like which one takes priority.
So taking it back to the survey real quickly, could you tell us what was there anything that really surprised you, whether it was good or bad, when you got the data back? Like what really kind of struck you?
Yeah. There was one data point about the criminal justice system that just, it was heartbreaking and remarkable. There was another about income and wealth. So death by cop is actually one of the top 10 leading causes of death for Black men. Like that was striking. There was and this data point came from research that was done by Rutgers. So it was a very reputable analysis and survey. But 1 in 1,000 Black men will die by law enforcement. And I thought that that can't be right. And so I actually went in and dug more deeply into the data. I actually called the researcher at Rutgers and said, "Is this right?" And so we talked through the data. He shared more data with us. Now, that might sound like, like how is that possible? So it's actually the 7th leading cause of death for Black men in their 20s, the 7th leading cause. Now, when you look at, the way that the data had been analyzed before, homicide was the number 1 leading cause for death, a cause of death for Black men in their 20s. But when you disaggregate, the cause, the type of homicide, the number of homicide, generally speaking, goes down, but death by cop happens to be the 7th. That was one. The other I mentioned the other one, where we have, for every $1, there's 7 cents of wealth. The thing that was striking for me there was that gap, adjusting for inflation and things like that. I mean, we were earning more now than we were 50 years ago, but the gap between Black and white now in terms of income is exactly the same almost as it was in the late 60s and early 70s. And so, I was dumbfounded and struck by that. And, the other thing that makes that more, so heartbreaking for me is there's a rising tide opportunity for the country as a whole if we end up closing that gap, right? There would be $5 trillion in the economy. No, the $5 trillion annually, the GDP would increase by $5 trillion if we close those income gaps. There would be $300 billion more in the market for private firms if we close those gaps. So, part of me is like, okay, if that number, if closing the race equity gaps around income and wealth, I get that it's important for Black families and Black communities for that to happen. And we are arguing for that and we are fighting for it, and we have been fighting for it, but it's not a universal interest. Yet when you look at $5 trillion in the GDP and $300 billion into private business, it's for everybody, for us So, those numbers, were not part of my consciousness, before doing this work. And the minute that I saw those things, it for me, it just became much more compelling to be in this job.
Thank you. Those numbers really truly leave me speechless. They really do. So kind of taking it back to what you were talking about a little bit earlier, can you, are you considering any bias training for children? And kind of the concept of starting to build change on the younger generation, or are you aware of already existing bias training specific for children that we could maybe have access to?
Oh, I did hear about a book for children, but it wasn't. I want to say it was more like middle school age, and I can't remember the name of it honestly. If it comes to mind, I'll send you a note to share with everybody.
And Eileen has put a book that she just recently bought. Oh, look, that we even have a show and tell here, a kid's book about racism. But yeah, Mike, if it comes to you, that's great.
Yeah, but I mean, but it's an important thing, So number one, I think there's a lot of change that has to happen, K-12, generally speaking, and that's a very different conversation than what we're having now. I say that as a parent. I say that as somebody who's looked at a lot of interesting data around education, but. I think one of the reasons we do have the problem that we've been having in this country for so long is because there is such incredible revisionist history that we end up learning. We don't learn much about Jim Crow in high school civics, and there are a lot of people, amazingly enough, come out of a high school education and don't have a complete understanding of the role that African Americans have played in the country, or the experience that African Americans have had in the country. And I think that is something that we really have to focus on when we're talking about moving forward and creating an anti-racist society. Or even, even if we're not, if anti-racism is the moonshot, at least creating a society of people who have better awareness and more compassion, toward their fellow man, right? But so on that side, I think there definitely needs to be, just education reform. We have not had, any trainings for children, but it is something that, I think is necessary to, have at scale, quite frankly, and make part of the education system.
Well, unfortunately, we're getting close to the end, which I don't know about anyone else, but this is completely flown by for me. This feels like boiling the ocean in some ways, because it's just really hard. What's one thing that each of us can do in your mind that could help us kind of leaving today?
So I think educating, yourself is important. Understanding yourself and where you sit is really important. Everyone has a bias. Bias is something that we're conditioned to think about the world in certain ways. And I think the very first step for anybody is to really sit with yourself and ask the question, where do I fit? Where do I live within the space of racism and anti-racism? That's one. I would say the other is, look external. Where do you see racism, right? Get really thoughtful and analytical about that. I'm sure every single one of us have been in a room where someone says something that's the wrong thing to say, right? And have we challenged it? I think that, have we sought to persuade, the individual, or, in the organization, if we look around and see that, our colleagues aren't being treated fairly, are we doing anything about that? We're all part of the solution. And quoting, someone I admire deeply, Don Lemon, silence isn't an option, right? So it's important to not be silent about who you are and suppress, how you honestly may feel about something, because you can't change from that. And certainly looking outward asking the questions, how can I be a part of the change?
So one, maybe the last question, maybe not. I always like to ask kind of, what's the ask? How can we help you? What's your ask of us?
Well, I think doing those two things helps me out enormously. Doing the two things you said a second ago. But, you know, part of the challenge, you know, I say this, like, you know, to friends often, so I'll say it to you guys because I feel very close to you all of a sudden. We've had coffee together. You know, for thousands of years, people would look up at the night sky and see this glowing orb and say, I want to go there, right? They want to go to the moon. And it wasn't until we really invested in it that we were able to do it, right? I'm trying to build NASA. I'm trying to build all the right tools because we don't have them. And part of the reason that's the case is, I would say, for as long as we've been talking about racism, it hasn't been invested in. You know, so, you know, a lot of the things that, you know, I mentioned we need, you know, the K-12 education reform. I believe, and I've been talking to Roy Wilson about this at Wayne State. We need to have an institute for anti-racism in this region. It's shocking to me that we happen to be one of the most innovative regions in the country, yet we haven't really been moving with the speed and the pace that we need to address it. Let's create an institute. All of these things require, you know, capacity. And so, you know, to whatever degree, you know, you are able to invest in organizations like ours, because there are many of them across the country, please do. Your support is needed.
Thank you, Mike. I'm so incredibly privileged that you came and talked to us. I feel honored that you shared your time and that you shared your knowledge. Just a quick note. So for those of us that are members of Impact 100 Metro Detroit, you'll know that we do have these coffee and conversations pretty regularly. We've switched to doing them once a month on the last Thursday of the month. So our next one will be September 27th. We don't have a speaker confirmed quite yet. So I'm just gonna take the prerogative of saying I'm going to work with Mike, and we will we'll identify a speaker that's along the lines of one of the topics that he's covered today, so that we can continue our conversation in this. Impact 100 we are committed to learning, to educating, and to supporting the nonprofit heroes that are doing the work in social injustice and racism. And Mike, we are grateful that you're there doing this and helping us. We have a few more. I did record this. We'll put it on YouTube and put it in our channel. We do have some additional, so September 27th is our next coffee and conversation. We also are starting happy hours with Heart in August. So we'll make sure everyone sees that. Nancy Moody, who's the Vice President of Public Affairs for DTE, is going to join us talking about, and I think she's connected with what you're doing, Mike. She's going to be talking to us specifically around the issue of courage. And then we're really excited that we're going to be celebrating the 19th or the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which is the right to women's vote. We're going to be doing we're calling it the equality, the power of women's vote, confirming our speakers, but it looks like it's going to be August 26th, which is the actual day of the 100th anniversary. So stay tuned, everyone. We'll make sure everyone receives all of these information. Mike, Deborah, thank you, both of you, for being leading us today, and we're just really grateful for your time and for your talent.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.